Fantastic. Okay. Cui bono? Who benefits and for whom, right? I mean, I think that there were a lot of connected threads. Jaron started with the core question is for whom, right? And Bob sort of concluded there too. We went from the 3 E's of equity, environment, and economic opportunity, the 8 particular policy recommendations that Jaron laid out that's in the Next Stop Justice report, all the way to Malcolm giving this really fascinating history of CCDC. I mean, those 5 organizations, and that's been at the core of the 37-year, venerable history of like one of the most important CDCs in the country. That was fascinating. And the reality of those 6 pedestrian deaths in the last year. Jessica, I think there were a lot of really compelling things in your talk, and in particular, moving from a service need to a justice issue was one of the many things that stood out with respect to how we think about transit. And then, finally, thanks, Bob. What gets funded and built, and for whom? With all that, we have some time for questions. And my ask is that people please do pose questions. I see one hand. I see a Julia Wong going once. Okay, Julia.
I was just wondering, Bob, if you could elaborate on the connection between climate change and segregation.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I mean, the origins of the climate crisis and origins of segregation are the same, right? The suburbs are a result, and this is another thing. During Plan Bay Area, we turned out all these, some people call themselves freedom riders. They drove in on a coach bus from Marin to come to the Plan Bay Area vote. All these white folks from Marin, with no sense of irony using the phrase freedom riders. It was the most amazing friggin' thing I'd ever seen in my life. It made me want to just leave the Bay, but those origins are the same. I mean, the highway system that facilitated sprawl and influenced land value and prices and access to land, right, set up the kind of patterns of sprawl, right, that intersected with redlining that happened in that same period and prevented communities of color. I don't know if folks have seen the Ta-Nehisi Coates article in the Atlantic magazine on reparations. It's a great article. What's great about the article is he doesn't just talk about like the origins of slavery, he talks about contract housing policy in Chicago and segregationist housing policy in places like Chicago. It's an amazing piece. But those origins, if you build the highway system, all public subsidy, right? Tons and billions of dollars before we had a gas tax at the federal level to build that out. You exclude people of color from those communities, right? With more amenities and better schools and you empty out the city, right? You embed segregation. And then like 60 years later, folks rediscover that cities are great places. And they're moving back in, and I think we ought to have a really aggressive climate change policy, and I think we ought to try to limit sprawl, but we can't do that by forcing out those folks. So I think of it as just a big circular pattern. We subsidize the exodus of black and brown and working people, and now we're recapitalizing it. And I mean, you could say, well, that's a very particular left political economy analysis, but it's the stated policy of the state of California, smart growth and TOD. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. I mean, that's what it is. And there's not a robust component funding-wise or legally. And we're in San Francisco with, I don't know, Malcolm's more of an expert on this than I ever be. We have nationally recognized pretty strong tenant protections, right? Is that fair to say, right? And do you think, I don't know, what can we do around, I'm going to put you on the spot. What are we doing in the face of this wave? I know that wasn't totally your question.
This has been an ongoing conversation we've been having for several years now, and I think that it's been one of the scarier kind of elements, I think, from our perspective around, an argument or sort of a push to try to impact climate change, that sometimes it becomes devoid of sort of the human impact of it. You're asking a question that I honestly don't have an answer to. I think that we've been trying to push on a number of different sort of policy issues to try to address this. I think one of the things that for me has been extremely challenging to accept is that as we move towards this one, or I guess we've approved the one Bay Area plan, or I don't know, whatever. There's this conversation and this recognition within the plan, and actually only really at the urging of a lot of advocacy that is starting to sort of recognize the impacts of displacement. You know, but at the same time, I think what is worrisome is that we're opening the door for this kind of really kind of reverse white flight, right? But we're not thinking seriously and committing seriously the kind of resourcing that we're going to need to be able to maintain levels of diversity within sort of urban cores like San Francisco, Oakland, and San Jose. And you know, I don't exactly know what to do about that on a regional level, and I think that's part of the challenge in terms of how we've related or not related to sort of regional level work. And in many ways, you know, we've kind of reverted back to some of the you know, the existing formula that that we've been using, which is investing very deeply in kind of local work, local politics, local policy to really address this. So, you know, and I mean, I don't know that there's a magic answer. I don't know that we're actually doing anything differently as a movement than what we've done before, other than sort of intensifying the level of effort, which is, you know, tenants' rights. You know, I mean, it's like a block by block, unit by unit battle, pushing for more affordability, you know, pushing, I think, for neighborhood level controls that try to guarantee, you know, some level of sort of complete neighborhoodness. I don't know if that's a word, you know, but for low-income and working-class neighborhoods, I mean, you know, I don't know. I don't feel like we're doing anything, you know, different. It's just we're doubling down on having to do it because we're hitting one of these periods where I think we are facing some serious questions around, you know, what the city's going to look like.
There was the whole movement on transit and affordable housing after Prop 13 came from the bottom up. It came from all of our communities. It came from labor and the huge battle that was fought for transit fees. Two battles. Ongoing funding stream eventually was abandoned by Dianne Feinstein, and new development had to pay into it. Those came literally from the unions and from the community organizations. And when I look at who is dealing with transportation right now, it's deadening bureaucracy. It's a CTA, which is the same thing as a board of supervisors. They have become professionalized. An MTA, which is, I apologize if anyone is here from the MTA, pretty useless professionals. And so the really hard issues keep coming up from the community. They came up on connections for the buses in the South of Market, in the Mission, in Rincon Hill, in Chinatown. All those I am aware that I've been dealing with, and Potrero Hill. People keep saying connect Muni, because Muni doesn't connect to 3rd Street. It's one of the great sins of Muni. And is it possible to do grassroots pressure back when it's become so bureaucratized between MTA and CTA? And it's just my world. I'm dealing with this. Help.
You got the right folks up here. These folks have all put pressure and run and worked and moves on.
We need to be back in their face. And it's hard because we've gotten a little rusty. And one of the things I have heard people on Potrero Hill raise the issue of no connections east-west from 3rd Street on Potrero Hill in the Mission Bay so many times. And the same thing in Rincon Hill. And the same thing in South Beach. And the same thing in Golden Gateway. And it's just like, it's a flash in the pan. I don't see anything. And Fernando and I were dealing with this 4 years ago about Chinatown not being connected to the waterfront. And how do we get these battles going again?
No, it's great. I mean, the one brief example I'll lift up in terms of a smaller campaign that came from our membership was stopping the T-train turnaround. And I think that does relate where, again, you know, it's sort of like there's there's competing needs in the system, but it's pretty intense even now. Still a challenge that we're working through, but because of the giant stadium, that particularly on game days, that and then there is a service station for the trains there on 23rd Street, but just in general and particularly on game days, the T train, that's the main line that connects Bayview to the city, would turn around right before it entered the neighborhood. I mean, it's actually not just right before, it's actually almost a mile walk if you're trying to get there. So people would be left on the platform for 45 minutes, for an hour, where they would basically be dumped off of the train. You have to wait for a train that's actually going to go into the neighborhood. So we did do a mini campaign around that. I think it is an interesting issue to raise around sort of like how do you do at a local level kind of specific campaigns that deal with specific lines and specific issues. On that, we found that John Haley, who's the director of operations, has been really responsive. It's still a mess, but we feel like there's a level of attention, at least to the issue. But I think in general, that level of disconnectivity is huge. We'd love to see even, if there was actually a bus line that connected the Mission to Bayview. It's right there, but it's actually can be really difficult to navigate in terms of transit. But yeah, I think that you're raising an interesting issue.
I wanted to say something about the bureaucratization that you're talking about. I have to warn you, I don't know that my thoughts are terribly articulate on this, but I feel like transit, more than so many issues, gets super wonky super fast. And, to be honest, I was feeling intimidated to be on this panel tonight, even though they're all such lovely people, because I am not a transit expert by any means. And it seems like almost every transit conversation, and this one hasn't really gotten there, turns to all the issues of the revenues and just, so many specific, I can't even name what the specifics are, right? And so not only am I lost, right, but it means so many community members are lost entirely. And I don't totally have an answer, so that was sort of my apology up front. But I think one thing that we're seeing, well, there's a couple things that we're seeing in the city that are really good. One is, it was really thanks to Choo Choo, who kind of like dragged SDA into paying attention to transit justice and was like, you guys need to be at the table. So thank you to Choo Choo, because we're glad we are at the table and they were right. But I think for groups like ours that are not predominantly a transit organization, I don't know if Power has had similar experiences, CCDC, it sounds like has, other organizations that tend to focus on housing or other issues, to say, we have to connect this. We have to talk about how transit is part of the bigger picture of justice for our communities. I feel like my hand gesture did that. I don't know if I imagined that. We have to talk about how transit is connected to justice for our communities overall, that we can't just leave it to the transit wonks. We can't just leave it to the policy bureaucrats. So that's one thing. I think also the actions against gentrification, people blocking the Google buses and saying this actually is connected, that when we're talking about all of this investment into private transit, that does have an impact on what's happening to public transit, and that has an impact on what happens to poor communities and people of color and seniors and people with disabilities and so on. And I think for us to continue to do that, to say we refuse to let this all be reduced into numbers and details that most of us don't understand, but to keep raising these big issues and to say, you are not going to write us off because we're not so-called experts on this issue, but we're going to keep showing how this is important for all of us.
Can I make one response to that point? And I'm not... So, I mean, I do agree with kind of the growing concern around the bureaucratization of transit policy, but actually I think it's more than just transit. It's planning and land use, it's housing. I mean, all across the board. I mean, the only thing I just want to make a comment, though, is that I feel like, as a movement, we're good at articulating sort of big picture issues. But oftentimes, I think, unfortunately, whenever we get down to kind of the nitty-gritty of negotiating the policy, oftentimes where we lose is in the details. And I think that we have to sort of continue to play a little bit of a sort of a dual role where we can't lose sight of the importance of understanding, that level of detail around policy, just because, it's where we lose. I mean, at the end of the day, it's those loopholes in language, it's It's an inability to kind of keep up with kind of the data analysis, and as a result, getting outgunned on sort of data at every turn. Where I think we run into trouble, and so I don't want. I mean, I hope as a movement we don't shy away from that entirely. Although I do understand that it's incredibly challenging to kind of operate in this universe right now.
I would just add that really quickly. I agree with Malcolm and Jessica in that sense, but the policies get changed by political organizing. They're not laws of physics. The wonky stuff that Jessica's talking about is like, we can't use this pot of money because it's only for capital to build things, right? None of you care about that, but that's not, those are set policies. It's not like the money gets printed and it says only for building or buying cars. They're political. The reason 80% of the federal transportation budget, $100 billion a year, is for highways, 20 is for transit. Almost all of the 20% at the federal level is for capital and new investment. Almost none of it's for operating. The little bit that we have for operating, Ronald Reagan passed that in like 1982. I mean, that just shows you where the political rhetoric and the debate and policy is going in the country. But I would just say, I agree with Malcolm. We do need to have that expertise, which is why I used to be an organizer, and I try to work in policy now, and I try to assist local groups and build that campaign. But we can change those things too. That's the other thing. They're not set in stone.
Yeah, I think it's also worth mentioning that the question of technical expertise is something that's run through previous idea conversations. So John Elberling and Calvin in particular were talking about staff at CDCs when they were started in San Francisco in the 70s, and how there was, I think, more investment, both, they said, in organizers and in people with technical skills when the CDCs first started, and maybe things are coming full circle and we're seeing more reinvestment now.
And maybe we have less barriers between the two, so that the organizers are the experts because they already are the transit experts, and that the policy people are not so far away from the base as well.
I'm wondering if we should just stack questions, just so that because we may not be the most short burst panel of answering, so then we could at least kind of make sure we hear from the people here, and then we could see what we.
Can you just raise your hand if you have a question?
Okay. My question comes from what you all were just discussing, and I think I'm on point, but I'm not sure. The election that we just had, where there was a proposition, Prop B, about planning in the waterfront, passing by the voters, one of the main arguments against that was we can't micromanage the way we're going to develop a neighborhood. Yet at the same time, that passed by with a landslide vote and a really minor turnout. But I think that speaks to the bureaucratization. I think it's important to have an understanding of what goes into making a good decision, but we can't lose sight of turning it into some kind of a politicized event that will attract people and make them think that they have not just a stake in an outcome, but a way to influence the outcome. I think that's important, and it's reflected in the outcome from Tuesday. Is there a way to turn a proposition or turn a conversation like this into a ballot measure or a signature gathering campaign or something?
Yep.
My question maybe would be maybe a good last question. But, in San Francisco, we love to have a great discourse, dinner parties, you're sitting on the bus having a conversation with somebody, all these different opportunities to have a conversation with somebody. So I was wondering if the panelists and moderator or anybody in the audience had, maybe their top succinct, resources to one. Say someone's new to the issue of transit and transit justice. What are your best resources to get somebody to come into the conversation efficiently and really feel like they'd be ready to participate in the conversation at an effective level? How do you get somebody in quickly? 2, where is the vision, where is the expression of the vision that you have of an ideal transit system, and where can someone learn about that more and know how much it would cost from operation and capital perspective? And where could somebody find the most compelling stories? I was actually very affected by the stories that you told tonight, including pedestrian deaths and cost comparisons regarding what it costs to do free muni versus, when project budgets balloon unexpectedly. So thank you. Those are my three sources of information that I requested.
Thank you. Chris? Great, thank you all very much. I guess if you might speak a little bit about the prospects for a larger coalition around all of these transit issues and communities that have been hit especially hard by some of these problems and challenges. And it seems that the nature of transit policy might be so easy to sort of pick communities off against each other. And we've seen that certainly with free muni for youth versus operational budgeting and the rest. And so if you might speak a little bit about, and then labor being a big piece of that, because often it's pitted as riders versus drivers. So what prospects do you see for a larger coalition emerging around transit justice?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I guess maybe I'll try to merge sort of two of the questions. I'm not sure I can merge the third one, but I actually am glad that you brought up this question about sort of what's the ballot measure, what's the mass campaign that can kind of come out of a conversation like this. And I do think that I'm not going to give a specific answer to that, but more to say that I actually have felt that and feel that campaigns are a very, very effective tool for articulating a lot of these things that we're talking about. I mean, certainly articulating the bigger political message about what our transit system can be about. Two, being a great entryway, I think, for people to enter into a conversation, because in a campaign sort of setting, you can have the conversation and push people into action right away because there's a role for them. And I think in the midst of that, bigger political conversation, I think use it as a vehicle to sort of articulate and kind of suss out sort of vision. So I do think that the campaign conversation is important. I think we had been talking, for about a year or so around possible ballot measures for November around sort of transit. I think in particular sort of a charter amendment that would include sort of a general fund set aside, which in theory would be funded through kind of a revenue source, possibly the vehicle licensing fee, but coupling that, with kind of a mandated sort of equity baseline policy in there, as opposed to sort of just it being a policy at the MTA kind of board level, and then also coupled with locking down, the free muni programs as part of kind of that set aside, that process. I don't, at this point, I don't get the sense that's going to be on the table anymore for a number of different reasons, unfortunately, not the least of which is that the revenue measure itself is, a piece is not sort of risen to sort of the top of the agenda. But I would just say that I think that the conversation around kind of campaigns is really critical to these bigger picture questions.
I think in terms of I think that it's true that this is like a long-term project, and I think that our organizations being in relationship to each other, I think that there are, we are committed to moving forward resources for transit. And so even though, again, as been said, and I think, I just want to acknowledge Chem in the background, I think there's still efforts on the VLF afoot. And so there will be on the November ballot, even a GO bond. There's different funding things that happen. For us, we are interested in looking at where there are opportunities for a true progressive transit agenda. And that's where it's we were interested in the transit equity charter amendment. We will always be weighing in on this issue, and it's constantly in motion. So I think in terms of sources of information, I would say always for people, the number one thing is, there are, you could definitely check out our website. You could check out any of the groups that are up here, because But I think the most important thing is we need to join organizations. So, getting involved in, either any one of the transit kind of organizations that are out there gives us a vehicle to be organized, because it's a constantly moving terrain. And we constantly need to weigh in on what is happening. And unfortunately, there's a left and a right around every issue, including transit. So there's another panel, I think, coming up that we were looking at, where you'll see how does a more corporate agenda approach the issue of transit, and just to be clear, I mean, there are groups that may have political complexity to them, but I think if you look at a group like Spur, they're moving forward an agenda around development that includes an agenda around transit that's really different from Power. I know that for sure, and not to pick a fight, but I'm just saying, it's like we're not always on, there is a left and a right, and I think the more that we can get organized, what was exciting about Free Muni for Youth is that we're putting protagonism back in the hands of bus riders, who rides the bus, who uses this, and they should be the ones at the table making decisions. To see that the hundreds of seniors and people with disability who flooded to City Hall in a tiny window of time. I mean, that even got on the table some I don't know the window of when that idea got introduced to when the masses got mobilized, but that's the kind of thing that, what?
About 3 weeks.
3 weeks, and that's where we can see the possibility to leverage power and leverage change is through organization, in our assessment. And I will just make a plug, because we may be running out of time, that for those who are here, and Andy Blue's in the background, I just want to give a plug. I think the movement around around Plaza 16 and against this development in 1979 mission is really important. And I think all of the organizing that's happening around defending working class San Francisco is so important. So in terms of immediate next steps, I would really urge people to go on June 14th from 1 to 4 down to Mission and 16th, because I think that's how we begin to come together. And it is a transit issue. It really is, because they're manipulating the issue of transit, as Bob was saying, to try to push an agenda of displacement, and the forces in this room are the kind of broad united front in terms. That's from 1 to 4 on the 14th of June. The website there is actually, if you Google, our website is peopleorganized.org. So we're www.peopleorganized.org. For the movement, if you want to directly get involved in Plaza 16, if you just put in Plaza 16, there's a website with incredible up-to-date information around that. And I think Andy's going to hand out some information. But I think that's where that issue of coalition comes in, that actually the people in this room who represent whatever bases you're representing, the more that we come together and stand together around saying we won't, like Bob said, everybody has said on this panel, Senior and Disability Action Network is always on the vanguard of representing. The more that we see true solidarity, that we see a common interest and a common cause around this, the more we can really advance the kind of policies we need to see. And stopping this development is a top of that agenda, in our opinion.
I just want to echo what Jaron was saying about being involved in organizations, and partly I think within Power, within SDA, within other organizations where the expertise of living in the community and experiencing transit is an important part of the knowledge set. And I know that's not exactly what you're getting at, but I think it's important to bring up, getting back to the kind of bureaucracy question, for us to constantly be reminding people in those conversations on the bus or with our neighbors or whatever, that you don't have to know all the details to actually be important to speak up and to weigh in on these issues. And as far as the coalition questions, I'm pretty proud, although I came in a little bit late, so I don't know how much credit we get, but of the coalition that we've formed, the organizations up here and a few others, Choo Choo and Human Services Network, and I'm sure I'm going to miss a couple, but to say that we really need to work on this together. And again, organizations that aren't always working on transit, or maybe that's not our first issue, but to say we have to stick together on this. And I think, kind of going back to organizations, a lot of that education about drivers versus riders, or one group versus another, happens in those organizations or in those coalitions. I know Jaron was talking about with issues of cars, right, and limiting driving, and kind of how do we talk about that, right, where people would at first say, well, no, that's going to affect my ability to drive, but okay, I understand how that impacts my whole community. And I think where we can come together and have those conversations about, yeah, this might be hard, and how can we work this out in a way that's good for everyone, with that conviction that we all are continually getting out there, that is possible, that we can have a just transit system, we can afford it, we will get there.
I would say, yeah, get involved with an organization, organize. That's the only way we move things, is by organizing and be part of, really strong organizations. This city has a lot. I'm actually optimistic on the transit funding. We have huge needs. Even the fall ballot measures that could go on, like the VLF, aren't significant enough. We've been working with and talking with folks on Bike Coalition, other people. I believe there's still grand bargains that can be put together in the coalition. I'm always optimistic about that stuff when people can align self-interest. And I think we can get there and generate more revenue. I mean, we're prepared, the groups that have been working together to get out there again and talk about the next set of measures. I think a lot of people looked at the Free Muni Coalition folks and thought, oh, you're just a single issue group, you're going to go away. That's not going to happen. These folks are going to work on the work because it's a huge issue for low-income people who are transit-dependent in the city. We're going to need a big coalition to pass some of these measures. And like I said, even the measures that are in place are not enough. On resources, I could talk offline, but the Bus Riders Union has great reports if you really want to get a very clear perspective with power. I also believe in reading the other side or the other sides. I'm a big believer in that. So I would look at something like, if you want to see the more kind of mainstream debate that has some of the edges of this debate, like Atlantic Cities, and there's other kind of more mainstream publications where you can read some of the stuff where sometimes there'll be a critical assessment, but I actually believe not just the echo chamber, but you should read what the other polls are talking about and doing. So I think that's important. Yeah, and in labor, I'll just say, this is just speaking for myself, I consider it a really huge political failure on the work that I've done in San Francisco around getting us to work more closely with labor. We've had some really good victories and great coalitions in East Bay, I have to say, with ATU 192 and some of their leadership. I'm not saying that's on the leadership of TW, to be clear. I think, and all the other unions, I think we, the collective left and people who are working on transit, need to work harder. We need to work, more, I think, both strategically smarter and be more tactically aware on some of this stuff. And I think there's more work to do on that. I think we should own, our lack of bringing labor in a strategic way around these issues. But Jaron's point is still the most salient one. That's the largest kind of union led by people of color, representing people of color. It represents good jobs in the city, the same way the BART jobs represent some of the few good jobs. Most of us, at least on, what we work with, don't think we can just give those away. We don't think it's a better way to have transit. But, we've got to do more on that side. And I think, I think we should own the areas where we're not doing, the best movement building work that we could do, and we need to do better. But I think, there's lots of opportunities going forward. There's a huge need, like we said, and there'll be other funding measures no matter what happens this fall, even if we do pass something.
So on that note of the fundamental democratic spirit of the intellectual abilities, right, of working people, of popular protagonism, of joining organizations, and of getting involved in pragmatic, practical, banal ballot measure fights, thank you for coming. Thanks to our panelists, and we're ending a minute early. Good night. Get home safe.